Hi, my name is Tatiana Lee, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today. We are Respectability. Our mission is to fight stigmas and advance opportunities so that people with disabilities can participate in all aspects of society. I want to welcome you all. Today, we are going to have an awesome webinar on how to ensure a welcoming lexicon and accessible websites and social media and inclusive photos. I am your moderator today. My name is Tatiana Lee, and I am the Hollywood Inclusion Associate at Respectability, working in communications. We are currently waiting on our captioner. So please bear with us. We are a little bit behind schedule. We are waiting for a captioner. We know we are talking about, our captioner is here. Yay. We are talking about accessibility. And so we want to make sure that this presentation is very much accessible to everyone. And now our captions are live. Yay! See, we sometimes have difficulties, but we just got to go with the flow and keep it moving, keep it moving. So thank you so much for welcoming us. Again, I am Tatiana Lee. I will be your moderator, and we are going to be talking about a welcoming lexicon, accessible websites, and accessible social media. And I will be your moderator, and we are going to introduce in a minute the rest of our panelists. Next slide, please. I want to thank so many of our partners within our Jewish community that have joined us to partner with us. We have so many, and I want to direct you down to the bottom. All of these amazing organizations have made it possible for us to bring you this webinar today, including Keshet, which we have one of our amazing panelists from Keshet, and so many others. So you can check them all down below. And next slide. So we have some amazing additional webinars that are going to be a part of this Jewish community series. And our next ones will be in 2 weeks from now, Tuesday, August 4th, how to create and implement successful diversity inclusion initiatives, and one on Tuesday, August 11th, how to ensure legal rights and compliance obligations. So look for those webinars coming up soon. You can check out that link and sign up because they're going to be great. You do not want to miss them. Next slide, please. So, disability in the Jewish community. According to the US Census, fully 1 in 5 people in America live with a physical, sensory, cognitive, mental health, or other disability. A landmark study by Respectability of more than 4,000 Jewish respondents in 2018 found that more than 90% who responded indicated that this was a priority for them. But we also did another survey with nonprofits that showed that inclusion is practiced by less than 1/3 of nonprofits. So what that tells us is there is a gap between will and skill. So this webinar series is going to fill in that gap so that you have all of the tools needed to be accessible and inclusive to the disability community. So we are going to help you close that gap. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. We have River McMicken and Sharon Rosenblatt. I am going to let them introduce themselves and take you through parts of our rest of our webinar. Next slide, please. River, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is River McMicken. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am the Development and Communications Project Manager at Keshet, an organization working for full LGBTQ equality in Jewish life. And today I'm going to talk to you about including people with disabilities in your storytelling. Next slide, please. And the reason you want to include people with disability in your storytelling is because people with disabilities are already in your audience. Your audience is already very diverse. You have Jews with disabilities, Jews of color, LGBTQ Jews, interfaith families, many other diverse viewpoints already exist in your audience. And when we have inclusive storytelling, we are explicitly welcoming these people in your audience into your community and to participate in your community. We all recognize the need to include these diverse voices in our storytelling, and sometimes it is hard to know where to begin. Fortunately, there's a simple process to help you get started, and that process is to audit your materials and then fill in the gaps. Next slide, please. To audit your materials, the first step is to look at your materials, look at your marketing, look at your training materials, your website. Ask yourself really critically, whose stories are you sharing? Whose images are you showing? Who is missing? And also what assumptions you're making about your audience and about the demographics that you're serving and representing. And this isn't just about ability, this is also about age, race, gender, socioeconomic status, any number of marginalized characteristics or demographic characteristics. Try to get multiple people to help you in this review. You want a lot of different viewpoints. And then once you have those notes about who you're including and who you're excluding, it's time to fill in the gaps. Next slide, please. So to fill in the gaps, you're going to commit to sharing diverse experiences in your storytelling. The way you do this is you need to actively seek out and hire people with disabilities to share their stories. You can engage your community to help you. You can turn this into a public commitment to include these voices. You really want to challenge yourself to include all the voices in your community. And keep in mind, it might not be possible to review and revisit all your materials and media right out of the gate. You want to start with the stuff that is most important and the stuff that your community will engage with most often. Next slide, please. And so the best way to accurately represent people with disabilities is to include us in the storytelling process. This is, in a way, the most important slide here. A lot of, if you want to tell stories of people with disabilities, you need to hire us, you need to interview us, you need to include us in your storytelling. We can help you. And along with that, we also need to think about the best ways to tell these stories. Next slide, please. So first of all, for your stories to have any impact, your audience must be able to understand it. This means thinking about not just the accessibility of your materials, but also the readability of your materials. Readability is something that's often overlooked, but improving the readability of your materials will help everyone in your audience, and especially people with cognitive disabilities, dyslexia, or language processing disorders. Some really simple ways to improve the readability of your materials: keep your messaging direct, keep your sentences short, and especially in a Jewish context, you want to provide translation and reference for Hebrew, Yiddish, any specific terminology. You don't want to make the assumption that people already understand these terms. So now that we're thinking about how to tell the stories, let's talk about specific ways we can do that and specific language we can use. Next slide, please. First of all, for communications professionals, we know we need to choose our words very carefully. So here are some really quick tips about talking about disability in general in a respectful way. And the first thing is to say the word. Like, disability is not a bad word. It is okay to say that someone has a disability. It is okay to use the word disabled. However, we want to be really careful how we're framing this. So we want to use phrases like non-disabled instead of able-bodied. We don't want to use euphemisms. A lot of euphemisms are very insulting. And again, disability is not a bad word, so we don't need to avoid it. We do, however, want to avoid passive victim words. We want to use respectful language. We want to also be really aware of common ableist language. The word crazy is a great example of this, which is often used very casually, but is in fact an ableist term. And also avoid referring to the disabled in a group way, in the same way you would avoid referring to like the Asians or the Jews or the African Americans. It's not a respectful way of communicating. So this is about talking about disability in general. And also I want to mention, we do have a Q&A box. So if there are any specific questions, if there are any specific things that come up while I or anyone else is speaking, you can pop a question in there and we should be able to get to them at the end of this. So disability in general, but we also need to talk about sharing stories with individual people with disabilities. And there are some other details to consider when we do that. Next slide, please. First thing I want to say is we want to focus on people with disabilities as individuals, and we want to tell their individual story. We want to center the person and not the disability, and you want to focus on their story. You want to focus on them as people and not on their disability, their adaptive equipment, their medical history, or anything like that. Remember, one person's story is only that one person's story, so be careful not to make assumptions about them or about other people with disabilities. Also, be careful you're not using someone's story to create inspiration porn. People with disabilities are not inspirational or courageous just because they have a disability, and their story should not be used solely to inspire people without disabilities. And this is all about respecting people with disabilities when we include them in our storytelling. Another way to show that respect is to use language that best reflects their lived experience. Next slide, please. One of the questions is, how do we refer to people with disabilities? How do we talk about people who have a disability? And there are two ways we typically talk about these individual experiences. We use people first language, and there is also identity first language. People first language puts the emphasis on the person first, followed by a description of the disability. You are hearing this every single time I say people with disabilities. And then there's identity first language. Identity first language is used by some specific groups. And you see that when in phrases like an autistic woman, the autistic rights community, the culturally deaf community, those are a couple of communities that lean towards identity first language. So the next question, of course, is like, when you're talking about someone, how do you know what language to use? Next slide, please. So in general, you want to use people first language. However, because we're talking about specific people and specific stories, you can ask them their preference. Don't be afraid to clarify with people how they want to be spoken about, how they identify themselves, and how, very importantly, how they want you to identify them. The way people talk about themselves may not be the way they want you to talk about them. Like, I may use identity first language for myself, but only in certain situations or in certain communities. So related to that, if you're talking about a larger group, an organization, or someone's involvement with a larger group or organization, you can also look at best practices for that organization. Just sort of be aware of these nuances and make sure you're doing due diligence and clarifying them before you use these words. Next slide, please. So those were your basic guidelines for talking or writing about people with disabilities. Part of our storytelling, though, of course, is also the images that we choose and the way we use visual storytelling. So these are just some quick tips for portraying disability in your visual storytelling, in your images, and so on. First one, again, it's the same as writing. Focus on the person and not on the disability. Focus on their story. One way to do this, of course, is to choose really celebratory images. Show people with disabilities participating in Jewish community life. Show them in these settings. Show them with people. Show them living their lives. And make sure that these images are authentic. It's insulting when someone pretends to have a disability. We don't want staged photos. And don't use generic images, right? There's like a lot of times you'll see a generic image of a pill bottle or of a wheelchair or of a hospital, and none of that is meaningful. That doesn't accurately reflect the role that people with disabilities play in their communities. And along with that, you can't interchange people with disabilities. You can't use one person with a disability to represent all the people with disabilities in your community. One image is not inclusion. You need to have multiple images. You need more people. And this, again, is like really about challenging yourself to accurately reflect the many voices and the many stories in your community and reflect all of that into your storytelling. Once you have sort of gotten started though, you still need to keep going. Next slide, please. And so that brings us to this point, which is inclusion and accessibility are ongoing tasks. This is true not just of our storytelling, it is true of website accessibility, it is true of any accessible media that you are creating. You need to keep going. You need to keep coming back to it. You need to have a point of reference for your accessibility goals. So in the case of creating inclusive communications, this could mean creating an inclusive communications guide. Make sure your team has access to it. A guide can include how to talk about people with disabilities, terms you use, resources you have available to you. And as you can see, there's a couple of examples there on screen. You will be getting the slides after the webinar, so you'll be able to click through those and check them out. And as I mentioned at like the very beginning of this, you probably can't do all your materials at once. So consider, as you're moving forward, regularly revisiting older materials. Revisit them, make improvements, and maybe even schedule that out to make sure that eventually you have audited, looked at, and updated everything you can to make it as inclusive as possible. And that is it for content. I think the next step is going to be talking about how this content can be actually made accessible on your website or in a digital format. So thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, River. My name is Sharon Rosenblatt. I am the Director of Communications at an IT consulting company called Accessibility Partners. We work with our clients to help make their websites, software, hardware, mobile apps, and documentation accessible for people with disabilities. I lead the document remediation team as well. And I'm going to run through a little bit more about digital and web accessibility and some actionable tips that you can take to hopefully make some of your content more accessible online to users with disabilities. Along with the slides that will be distributed online, I will be including a handout of some more web accessibility tips and tricks that you can also implement on your website as well. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So accessibility can mean many things to a lot of people, but in the digital space, it means equal access to information, and it encompasses all disabilities. Equal access doesn't mean equal usage. Many people with disabilities access their online content in a variety of ways using what's called assistive technology, like screen readers, voice recognition software, Zoom features, alternative input device. But when something is accessible, it means that people with disabilities can perceive the content, they can understand the content, it's easily navigated with their assistive technology, and it's easy to interact with their assistive technology. So following these 4 tenets, perceivable, understandable, easily navigated, and easily interacted, will make your content accessible to a wider range of people with disabilities. Go to the next slide. So just because of accessibility has a very broad definition, it's a bit of a spectrum, but there are guidelines to follow. This is where a bit of the alphabet soup comes from with a ton of acronyms. So the global body called the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, has developed the Web Accessibility Initiative a number of years ago, which has the acronym WAI. The W3C is not a governing body. They're just a technology think tank. So they can't enforce this. However, in the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is governed under our Department of Justice. And currently they are using what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, in my 3rd bullet, which the World Wide Web Consortium has created as standards for best practice for web accessibility. There are a number of other standards. However, looking into the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and I have the link on the screen, It is a good place to look if you want to start benchmarking where you fall with some of these guidelines and their standards. So next slide, please. So since we know that accessibility means that a user can interact with the information in a number of ways, it also means it has to be easily understandable. One of the basic tenets of accessibility is called alternative text, and this provides a textual alternative to any non-text content on web pages, emails, or any of your digital content for things like graphics, maps, charts, buttons, images, and more. Alternative text serves a number of functions, but for web accessibility, it's read by assistive technology like screen readers in place of those images. It allows the content and function of the image to be accessible to those with visual or even some cognitive disabilities. And for any marketing people on the phone, it also increases your SEO by having another thing on the back end. When you're authoring your own alternative text for these elements, you want to be accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content and function of the image. Is it a link? Does it convey important information? Or is it just decorative? You want to keep in mind how it's being used, if it's just visual enhancement or if it links to other areas. On my slide here, I have an image of my synagogue in Hamden, Connecticut. And this image could be used in a number of ways. It could be the home icon. In that case, I'd want alternative text to just say link to home. I could be including it in a year-end report, and maybe I would just have enough information to say the exterior of the building, or perhaps the body text gives enough of the content there as well. You can also avoid using phrases like image of or graphic of to describe the image. Assistive technology will pick that up. However, the medium really is important. If you want to say photograph, painting, what have you, that can also be included. It's whatever you want to be conveyed to the user with disabilities. So for the next slide. One of our suggestions for websites is that color alone should never be used to convey information. Users with visual disabilities such as blindness, color blindness, or color contrast deficiencies may not be able to easily understand the content that's being presented, and some users can't distinguish between colors, and roughly 7% of men in the United States are colorblind. And when websites are created with information based on color, that can be lost if a user is viewing it with a high contrast filter. I have a very interesting image on my screen that reads, click the green button to win a car or the red button to erase your hard drive. The buttons are different colored, but they're both textually labeled to go. A user who may be blind or using assistive technology does not have the color changes announced. So both would be read back as go, and obviously with very different hypothetical ramifications. That's not to say you can't use color on a website. Obviously, you know, that would be very boring otherwise. You can use other surrounding text to make emphasis. You can use other forms of style. But just being mindful of what the color use is conveying, and there should be alternative ways to put that information besides color. Next slide, please. So related to color is color contrast, and this is looking at your font on your foreground and the color of your background. There are a number of ways to check the color contrast, some free tools that I've included in the handout that we will distribute later, but it's looking at the ratio, and the WCAG guidelines have the proper ratios for font size with the colors to look for, but making sure there's enough difference between your foreground and your background color. If you have light text, making sure it's on a darker background, or if you have darker text, making sure it's on a lighter background to provide enough contrast. So next slide, please. A timeout on a website is employed to track how long a user has been inactive on a document or a website. If some of you on your web content have pages where you're trying to buy event tickets, there may be only a certain number of time to fill out payment information before those tickets might be released. Some challenges that users with disabilities face with timeouts are that the timeout warning isn't clearly identifiable on the screen or with their assistive technology. A blind user's screen reader might not be able to pick up on the countdown, and they won't even know that there is technical and time ramifications, or the timeout session isn't long enough for someone to complete an activity. You can make this more accessible by indicating in text how long an application session state is, prompting a user when the session is about to expire, and returning focus and providing notification when the session has expired back to the main page. Next slide, please. Hypertext links are one of the most basic elements of web and also web accessibility, therefore. They're crucial for movement and navigation. They're the threads that literally link us from page to page. Web accessibility, when you use standard hypertext links, they will work with all forms of assistive technologies and platforms, and users of all abilities can access them, whether directly or through the use of some assistive technology like the keyboard or voice recognition. Users must be able to navigate to and select each link using the keyboard alone. If you want to see how accessible some of your links are, you can start tabbing through your website, and I'll give some more tips about that in a little bit. But links should also make sense out of context. People who are blind, like those who are sighted, visit the parts of websites that are most applicable to them and skip to those pertinent sections. Phrases such as click here, more, or click for details can be ambiguous when read out of context. I've included a small example on my screen with the bullets. If you include the destination of your page as the actual link, instead of just saying click here, that's a good descriptive link. The next slide, please. Form fields are very important, especially since there are a number of nonprofits on this call, and we have a number of donor forms to fill out. Tab keys will move to the form fields, and they will also move to any areas for users to input information, like text boxes, radio buttons, checkboxes, and more. Text labels will describe the function of each form control. These labels, like the example I have on my screen, are positioned above or to the left, and labels for checkboxes and radio buttons are usually to the right. Sighted users will be able to visibly and visually associate a text label with its corresponding form control. However, when you're coding, you want to use the label element used to associate that text label with what's being filled out. So when a user who may be using a screen reader cruises through a form with their tab key, that information will be read back to them with the proper label so they can insert their information. And also, this is important for autofill. Many of us, want to have our address automatically populated. That will not happen unless you use the label element, since whatever browser you're using will not know what belongs in which field. So this can be quite a time saver and potentially lead to more donations the more accessible and easy to use your form is. And you also do not want to rely on placeholder attributes alone. This is a little bit more technical, but that's the gray text that shows up in a form field. This is not always read back via assistive technology. So really focus on using that label element when you code a form. The next slide, please. For multimedia, equivalent alternatives should be synchronized with the presentation. So this means not just adding captions for audio or movie files, but making sure they sync up with the file that's being shown in real time. Tatiana is going to give a little bit more information about captioning, but if your web content regularly includes video or audio, look into providing subtitles or transcripts, especially if you're producing the bulk of your own video content. You can see that some of the other hosting sites like YouTube will allow users to add subtitles, and I know Tatiana will give some more actionable suggestions as well. Next slide, please. So lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit more about keyboard usage. You may have heard throughout my presentation, I was talking about tabbing through elements like links or form fields. Any area where user, their input is required, like links, buttons, menus, or form controls, must be accessible over the keyboard. Any area that you can click on with a mouse should be reachable via the keyboard as well. You can test this on your own website using the tab and enter keys to see what you can engage with and interact if you can reach all areas. Some areas like your drop-down lists on your menus or any form fields may need to use the arrow keys and spacebar to deploy that choice. And also when navigating a page via the keyboard, a sighted user must have a visible indicator of what element currently has keyboard focus. You can think of this like the blinking cursor in a form field so that you know what you're currently filling out. Links may have a dotted black box around them where the tab key currently has focus, or maybe something gains an underline. You can test this as well by using your own keyboard, but making sure you have that visible focus means that somebody who may be on a different view or Zoom knows what element they're currently on and what they're currently interacting with. So again, I have many more actionable suggestions, but hopefully these are some that you can take home to your nonprofit's website and online content and make more accessible to users with disabilities. And beyond auditing it by yourself, definitely engage the feedback of other users with disabilities and any other stakeholders. Thank you. And furthermore, I forgot about this. I do have my contact information here. My name is Sharon Rosenblatt. Our principal partner at Accessibility Partners, Dana Marlowe, was a previous board member of Respectability. You can find us at www.accessibilitypartners.com, and we are currently on Facebook and Twitter if you'd like to engage with us via social media. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for all of that. I introduced myself earlier. I am Tatiana Lee. Now you have a slide where you can read a little bit more about me and a lot of the work that I do here at Respectability as part of our communications team. Next slide. Now Sharon talked a little bit about alternative text and captions and things like that. I am going to take it a little step further and talk about how you can apply that to your social media. So just some information about captioning. It helps with comprehension of the dialogue and the clarity. And actually 80% of viewers react negatively to videos audio playing with sound. So majority of people, even if they aren't deaf, will consume captionings for their videos. So that is something to think about. Majority of people already listen to their content with the sound down. So you're not only making it accessible to people with disabilities, you're also making it more accessible to audiences who use it, whether or not they live with a disability or not. Next slide, please. So these are some stats about how much people watch videos with sound off and all of those different things. YouTube, which are really great assets that I know a lot of you use for your social media. 85% of Facebook videos is watched without the sound. Like I told you, 80% are more likely to watch an entire video when captions are available. And then another stat that I think is very, very important, and I'm going to talk about alt text, which you heard a little bit from Sharon, but adding alt text also makes you makes your search engine optimization higher. So you're more likely to come up in Google searches and Yahoo searches and things like that when you're using alt text for your content. So it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Next slide. Just like website images on social media, you need to describe for individuals who cannot view them. So we're talking about, you want whatever the content is, you want them to be able to grasp what the photo is saying or what the photo is doing or the point of the photo. So you don't have to be too technical. If it's about, you want to show two women, then you say, this is a photo of two women and this is what they're doing and this is what the background is. But basically you want to give them an idea of the purpose of the photo. And these are some platforms that I'm just going to describe really quickly on how you can use them. So Twitter, for that, you have to actually go into the settings and there's an accessibility feature. So if you click on that, it will give you the option, and when you put up your picture on Twitter, you put it, and then there's an option there actually where you usually go tag someone. There will be a little section there that says alt text. When you click on that, you can type in and describe the photo. And there you go, you have a alt text photo that is ready to go for Twitter. For Facebook, it actually is when you go to upload the photo to your Twitter, you actually have to go and click edit. And then it will give you a place where you can tag people, and then it will give you another section that says alt text. So any places you see that alt text, that is where you're going to describe your photo, so that when someone is coming who is blind and they're using screen reader technology to consume the content, the screen reader is actually describing what the photo looks like for them so that they can experience it through that screen reader. Another one, Instagram, same thing. You go to the alt text, and then YouTube actually does automatic captions for you. It is very simple when you're going through fixing all the features and all the edits that you're doing to your YouTube video, hitting all the marks, doing all your little hashtags and things to make it searchable. There's a section on there to click closed caption, and then you can either choose to add a file or automatic caption. The best thing to do, and I highly recommend it, is use the automatic caption. Now, let me tell you, the automatic caption is not perfect. You do have to go back and edit in some of the words. So if you have some complicated names or something that is a little bit harder to pronounce, like Koch or Mizrahi or something like that, it may butcher it a little bit. So you just have to go back in and just edit it. It's very simple. It takes maybe 10 minutes or so, depending on how many different words you use, but just comb through it and just make sure all of those pieces are there, and you're ready to go, and you have a completely accessible captioned YouTube video that you can also take and apply to other platforms if need be. Next slide. So I go into this a little deeper. We have another webinar that we did that you can actually see me there too, on premium skills workshop on social media accessibility. So a lot of these tips and suggestions that I talked about, you can get in-depth tutorials on how it's done. My colleague and I, Eric Asher, walk you through it. So when you get a chance, this webinar and this PowerPoint will be available to you. It is completely accessible. We will make sure it is available to you, and you can click on this and watch that webinar and a whole bunch of other series that we have that takes you through step-by-step how to do your social media accessibility. Next slide. These are some apps that I suggest. Clip-O-Matic, which is a downloadable app on your app store. Clips, which is from Apple, which is another one. You can literally upload your video or talk directly onto it, and it will add your captions, which is really, really great. It makes it simple. So when a lot of people say, I don't know how to add my caption, these are literal programs and apps that are either free or low cost to you to be able to add captions. So Clip-O-Matic is one that I use pretty frequently, as well as Clips. Like I told you, YouTube is probably the best one that I've seen thus far. Like I said, it just needs a few edits. It's completely free, and that is my favorite cost. So check out YouTube. Also, there's a low-cost version called rev.com. If you don't have the capacity and you have a few extra dollars to spend, you know, contact rev.com. They will charge $1 a minute, and they have a 24-hour turnaround time. They will give you all the different variations of files that you need to have your caption, and you are ready to go. So those are some free and low cost options to do captionings. Next slide. So now we are going to open it up to questions. And I see we have a bunch of really great questions. I want to bring our panelists back because some of them you have for all of them. And so we are going to go into Q&A. So the first question someone has is define ableist. So ableist is a term to that is basically means discrimination towards someone who has a disability. Like if you hear racism, you hear sexism, things like that. Ableism is the same thing. It's the misconception or ideal that you have about somebody based on their disability. So when you automatically judge someone based on their disability, you are being ableist. So that is kind of a way to describe ableism. And another question is, one thing that confuses me is the use of the word disabled as in past tense. Why do we use past tense when the person has a disability in the present tense? River, did you have an answer for this? Someone wants to know about using disabled in the past tense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that usually when we use the word disabled, we're not strictly using it in a past tense context. We're using it as a descriptor. So we might say a disabled person rather than a person who has become disabled, which would be more the past tense way of looking at it. So, and also, I mean, there is something to be said for the fact that if you have a disability, strictly speaking, you're not disabled all the time. You can live with a disability, you can have a disability, and there are times when you are disabled, and then there are times when that particular disability isn't impacting your life in quite the same way. And so there may be times where that distinction is relevant as well.
Thank you. There's another one that's directed towards you, River. Could you talk about the preferences about people first language versus identity first language? They said most disabled friends that they have prefer identity first language, but they notice non-disabled people use people first language. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, really people first language versus identity first language is one of the more complicated things to figure out from a communication standpoint, because we're dealing with a question of what is general best practices versus what is individual preference. And this is where we get into things like, for instance, the autistic community tends to prefer identity first language. I, as an individual, tend to prefer identity first language. But I think person first language makes it easier to focus a story on a person and easier to tell stories about people in a more accurate way. You can describe someone, for instance, as a person who uses a wheelchair, and all that tells us in that moment is that in that moment, that person is using a wheelchair. That's it. We're not really talking about their disability in that context. We're talking about something that they are doing and that they are actively using. And there's an advantage to that. We're not just saying, oh, that's a disabled person. We are saying that is a person who is currently using this piece of adaptive technology, mobility device, assistive technology. You know, we're not making any assumptions about them when we say something like that. So really it's complicated. And this is why the sort of cornerstone there is if you're talking about people with disabilities, if you're talking to people with disabilities, if you're talking about specific disability communities, due diligence, research, and not being afraid to ask about it.
And I would add to that, as a person from the disability community, I'm a wheelchair user. I use it interchangeably. I say disabled person or person with a disability. It depends. I use it interchangeably because it is a part of my identity. But at the end of the day, I want to be called Tatiana. So I think when all else fails, call the person by their name. And next question, someone says, I work with children with disabilities and the parents often use the language special or special needs. Would you recommend we, the service provider, not follow the parents' leads and say child with a disability? Do you have anything to say about that?
Sort of an interesting question, because I think that mostly comes up largely in an educational context. And I'm going to say that there's another one of those things where I think if you ask 5 people, you might get 5 different answers. They're all going to be nuanced. I think in general, special needs is a little bit of a challenging term. We all have our own unique educational needs, and that is regardless of whether or not we have a disability. I think especially with children, saying children with a disability also doesn't tell us a lot about that child. It's okay to talk about the educational needs of a child without separating them out from their classmates or making it seem like those educational needs are special or different. We make a lot of adjustments in the way we teach children based on how those children learn, and we don't really think about it as special until we're talking about a child with a disability. So I'm not sure that fully answers the question. I will say this personally, I'm not sure I would get into a fight with a parent about that wording, but I would personally use the phrase child with disability, children with disability, if I even had to reference their disability. In general, I don't know if I would, I might just try to avoid that conversation entirely a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, one of the things that I say to people is at the end of the day, everyone has some sort of special need. So if you want to talk about special needs, everyone has special needs. I personally don't care for that word, but yes, there are some parents that use it. So, but again, I'm like River, I don't get into arguments with parents over that. So yeah, enter it with caution. It's a tricky topic. So another question is there stock photo websites that would have authentic photos of people with disabilities? Do you know anything about this, River?
Great question that I cannot fully answer. Tatiana, I know when we first started talking about this webinar, we talked about this topic a little bit about finding authentic images, and it turns out it's pretty hard. There are some resources, but of course, if you're using stock photography, you don't really know what context that photography was made under. So, again, this is a use with caution. And this is part of why I said, reach out to your community, engage your community to help you. And again, engage people with disabilities in your community. Because if you're photographing people who are from your community or who are connected to your community, then that will be a more authentic experience overall.
This is Sharon with Accessibility Partners. I have heard wonderful things. If you go to disabilityimages.com, they have a stock photo library there too. I have never frequented it or used it in any capacity, but I've only heard anecdotally that it's a great resource. So that's, again, I can put the link in the chat, disabilityimages.com.
Disabilityimages.com. Thank you. Okay. Someone says on Facebook, is it better to use alt text, write an image description in the post, or both? Personally, I've seen both. It helps, especially if you're sharing an article, because you can't put image description in an article. So I've seen, and I've done this myself, is put the image description underneath in the text. That helps because you don't always, and I didn't, because you don't always see it. So to put that, and I've seen people that do both. So I think both tactics are great. Does anyone have anything that they want to add? Okay. So from Facebook, if you're putting an image description on the description part of the photo, where even folks without screen readers could see it, should we also do the same? Oh, yes, I answered that question. Okay, so we had that question twice from two different people. So I'm glad we got that question answered. How much does live captioning generate cost? Is there a standard market rate? I do not know that answer. You would definitely have to contact different live caption services to see. I know that we have some resources. So if you reach out to Respectability, we have different resources of different companies that can do live captioning. It's in our toolkit. So if you look on our website, we have our toolkit. It'll give you suggestions for live captioning services. Okay, another question for River. Wow, you are popular today. How do you know you have talked enough people that are representative of a minority group to tell a story from that point of view?
All right, so that's kind of a tricky question. I think I want to kind of reframe that a little bit. Usually when we talk about storytelling and telling stories about people with disabilities, what we mean is essentially signal boosting the stories that they are telling you. You are facilitating them telling their own stories rather than telling stories about them. So that's sort of the challenge, is when we talk about writing about people who are part of a marginalized community, how do we generate empathy? And you see this a lot in like fiction writing, which is sort of when people write characters that are very different from them. Tread with extreme caution. Every single person's experience in a community is different. And even though you can talk to 15 people and they have similar stories, the nuance in between those stories is really meaningful and really important, and it makes them whole human beings. So I would say that there isn't a number of people that you can talk to where you can then feel really confident going out and telling a story about them. That said, if you are working with people from a marginalized community and you are working alongside of them to tell their stories, you now have a set of checks and balances. You have people you can go back to and you can say, hey, what I'm hearing is this, and the research says this. Is this accurate? Is this true? Is this a good way to describe this? And hopefully the feedback they give you will give you some help with that. And still, again, whenever you tell people stories, and especially if you're making any sort of generalizations, that's not going to be accurate for everyone. Sometimes you just need to accept that you are not going to always get it right. Occasionally, you're going to mess it up. You're going to tell a story incorrectly. Someone's going to be upset with you. You can own that. You can learn from that, and you can move forward and do better next time.
Thank you, River. So, question for Sharon. I've heard about accessibility testing for websites. Do you have any recommendations, and do you know generally how much it costs to test out the accessibility of websites?
So my favorite answer for this is it depends, which is never what you want to look into for an answer. But when we have clients submit their websites to us, we scope them out. Any good web accessibility company will want to scope your website based on the complexity and the types of user interactions and not a static number of pages. It's a science of looking at your main workflows and all of the types of user interfaces that a user of any ability might interact with. For a good audit, as I mentioned at the end of my talk, you would want them to have test engineers both with and without disabilities to validate their own work. Most of our sites for clients run between the $5,000 to $10,000 range. It depends how complex a website is as well. If there are many forms, if you have blogs, calendar features, resources that are stocked up. But usually an informational website runs around the $5,000 to $10,000 range.
Thank you. And do you recommend any website accessibility toolbar add-ons?
There are some great toolbars that can provide some automated checks. I always recommend their use be judicious and backed up with human judgment. I like the Web Accessibility Toolbar, just simply named for Internet Explorer. You can look into AXE, A-X-E, and that can be downloaded on Chrome and I believe Firefox. And they'll go through looking at your heading structure, form field labeling, images without alternative text. However, they're not going to validate if it's done correctly. So even if your image has the vaguest alternative text, you would get a false positive there that it passed. So again, those are great things to look into, but always temper it with your own judgment at the end.
Nice, thank you. So someone says, how can I help my Jewish LGBTQIA association to open up to people with disabilities? Being autistic and queer, gender nonconforming myself, I often don't see myself included in the organization's narrative.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's always a little tricky, right? There's a tendency to say that because we are focused on one marginalized community, there isn't quite enough room to also bring in another, potentially marginalized community and split our focus. Except there are plenty of people with disabilities in the LGBTQIA umbrella, and in fact, there's some degree of research to suggest that autistic people are more likely to be gender nonconforming. There's some really interesting stuff surrounding that like no one needs to listen to me rant about, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff and overlap there. So I think, but to answer it more directly, make your events accessible, make it really clear that folks are welcome, make it clear that you understand there are people with disabilities in your community and in your audience. This also becomes a practical question around issues like Pride. If you do anything as part of Pride events, you'll want to make sure that those are accessible. Pride is notoriously an inaccessible context. Make sure your communications are sort of disability friendly in terms of readability, in terms of accessibility. And like all of these other things, you know, look at your materials, look at situations where you can say, we're not really representing people with disabilities. How can we do that? There are a great number of LGBTQ Jewish advocates and activists with disabilities. You can reach out to those folks, you know, try to tell their stories, basically get people involved. It's challenging. It's challenging in general. But again, especially when you have two historically marginalized communities that you're trying to like bring together, it can be a real fight with, in terms of figuring out how you're supposed to focus your communications. I really wish I had a great answer for you. It is something that I am working with at Kesha. We work with this. We're trying to bring in these voices. We're still, we're always trying to represent more people in our community. And it's just something you have to think about every day.
Thank you so much, River. This was a great webinar. I think we covered a lot of really great material. I hope you guys feel equipped to really make all of your content accessible and inclusive to the disability community and all of its amazing intersections. In a follow-up email, you will get a survey. Please fill out that survey because we want to hear from you what you got out of this and more. Again, in a couple weeks, come back. We have some other great webinars coming up in 2 weeks. So make sure you stay tuned to check that out in a couple weeks. We also will have this webinar fully accessible, PowerPoint and captions and everything available for you by next week. I want to thank our panelists, River and Sharon. Thank you so much for bringing all of your knowledge and expertise to this conversation. If you guys have any questions, please contact Matan K, my fearless leader here at Respectability, who is in charge of California and Jewish leadership. And I want to say thank you all for tuning into this and being very attentive and bringing such amazing questions to this webinar. And I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.